R. Storey. He's wrote some great books. We're talking about Jack the Ripper, and then we're going to talk about more after we get done with Jack the Ripper. Now, hey, Neil, one thing I've always heard, now you can correct me because I'm probably wrong, that most of his victims were prostitutes. Was that true, or just, false things?
In essence, that's right, they were. In London at the time, they were often referred to as unfortunates, and there's a very good reason for that. The East End of London in the 1880s was a place of great poverty. There were people from all over the world that had fled there. Some of the folks from Russia, from Poland, Polish Jews, people who had been persecuted. It was a place where those that had fallen on the hardest of times would end up. And this meant that to earn sadly people turned to drink. So to get a drink and get what they used to call a doss for the night, a doss house, somewhere to go and sleep. And that would often mean, that you would sleep. You might have heard people say, I could sleep on a rope. Well, this was because in the old doss houses, you'd often be crammed into a room, almost everyone standing up. And they would string a rope in front of the doorway, and the people near the rope would bow over it. They would literally sleep hung over a rope. So it's a real hard up place. Now, prostitution enabled, or to sell their bodies, would enable these women to earn the few coppers that they could to get that doss for the night. And sometimes a woman would sell herself for a part of a loaf of bread that's gone mouldy even. It was absolutely tragic. And this was the tragedy of the East End, that because any of these women, they lived very precarious lives, sometimes home industries making matchboxes or paper flowers. But if something went wrong, maybe they took too much drink, or maybe they had a tragedy in their family, or a disability, or disabled child, or a whole host of things or just they're sacked for no reason, laid off from work. And the next thing they know, they too could be on the street. If these women hid away at night time to keep away from Jack the Ripper, they'd have to keep walking the streets, because you wouldn't even be allowed to sleep on the streets at night time. You'd be moved on by the police, and you'd have to find a bench to sit on and sleep during the day.
Now, what you're actually saying, they would get a room, it'd be dozens of people in a room, a small room. They would put a rope, and they would just kind of like bend over it, and that's how they slept?
That's right.
Oh, wow.
It was terrible. If you went to some of the other hostels that were often Christian-based, you'd have to go along and sing a few hymns, then you'd be given some hard bread, and you'd dip that in salt, you could have a bite of that, and then you'd go to sleep in a room that had you'd call it a cot bed, side by side by side, but they were wooden boxes. And they were often infested with sort of a cockroach, or there'd be rats crawling around there. So you'd wake up at night in this box that really did look rather like an oblong coffin, with a rat sat on your chest. It was absolutely horrible. Same for the workhouses. There was one called the Whitechapel Spike, and people you would not be allowed entrance if you had money on you. You had to have absolutely no money, and then you'd be put through a bath where there'd be 2 deep baths. You'd have to strip off, go through the bath, and it would be the same water that had been used by maybe 10 or 20 or more people in front of you. They used to say it had the consistency of something like a pea soup.
Wow, man, just thinking about that turns my stomach.
You would say, you'd just shake your head at those terrible, terrible conditions.
How about disease and all that stuff? I mean, you think about it. If you've had people that had anything wrong with them, it's contagious, and they go, oh, wow.
Absolutely right. And because you're living in a close proximity, you get diseases and sickness like cholera, scarlet fever. And there were also, if you did get work, children had to go to work. And infamously, they worked at a place called Bryant and Mays. They were a matchmaking company. They may still be going today. And they made these lucifer matches that contained sulfur. And there was an element of phosphorus in there. And the children and the women working in there that had been working there for what? It would get into their bloodstream, into their bodies. And they would end up with a condition called phossy jaw. Now, you could tell where these women and children were walking back home because they'd been exposed to all these fumes. They would vomit into the gutters, and it would be a sort of strange yellow, almost luminous quality to it. And if they were an advanced case of phossy jaw, not only were their teeth wobbly, if you pinched the tooth and the gum, you could probably pull the tooth out and part of the gum with it. That's how horrible it was.
That is really, really. I didn't even know that. It's a lot of. I don't think many people, the listeners here, even comprehend that.
It's the way things were in London, and you look at the old city. If you watch film even into the 1960s and 70s, you will see that a lot of the buildings, they were black, and they were black because of all the chimneys that were spewing out smoke. You think you want to heat a house in those days, you would have an open fire. It would be a coal fire. It's only really over the last 30, 40 years that they've started to clean the places up with pressure washers and new building and getting rid of a lot of the old Victorian slums after all these years. It's only recent times that we've truly lost the old East End.
Oh, wow. So what was when Jack Ripper was doing this, what was the murder rate? I mean, was it high or low or what? I mean, it's scary. Did they ever also, any thoughts of who Jack the Ripper could have been?
Well, the murder rate, it's a strange thing, that in history, over the last, say, 200 years in Great Britain, the murder rate has not changed all that much. There are different causes of murder. There could be some domestic strife. There will be pictures of murder when there is, for example, times of unrest, just after wars, before wars, when people can come back, and there were all sorts of issues. Murder rates can rise, but no, it's always been fairly steady, and it never has been an overly common crime. Physical assaults, yes, but again, it's all steady. You'll just get these little peaks now and again. But what about who was Jack the Ripper?
Yeah, who was?
After the crimes had, you see, they appeared to come to a stop after the killing of Mary Jane Kelly. So it seems that the police investigation seems to be wound down. Now, could it be that they found a body floating in the Thames? What could this be? Well, a man by the name of Melville McNaughton became quite a senior officer after the murders in Scotland Yard, the top place for the police, really, not just in the metropolis of London, but Scotland Yard is known nationally. It's the main centre in those days of policing. And as one of the assistant commissioners, he wanted a list of the prime suspects. And so, although they never identified exactly who it was, they thought, well, who are the likelies on this list? And the top of the list is a character. I think we've got to describe him as a sleeper suspect, and I'll explain why. His name is Montague John Druitt. Now, it appears he was kind of trained as a barrister. He may have had some medical training, and he'd been dismissed from the school where he was teaching, perhaps to avoid some sort of scandal with the boys. That was kind of the ambience of his dismissal, although it's never clear. But it's believed, and according to the memoranda, his family believed that he was Jack the Ripper. But the problem with the memorandum is that it never says why. I mean, there were hundreds of suspects, contemporary, in 1888, and there must have been other families that were just as concerned about, earnestly believing their relative is Jack the Ripper. So why was Montague John Druitt so high up that list? And that's never been properly explained. So he's a bit of a sleeper. He was apparently a very good cricketer, so they can tell you where he was playing cricket. They know his cricket scores, but the story of the man himself and the family view, we don't know. Okay, now, next on the list we will find Aaron Kosminski, or just Kosminski. He's a Polish Jew. He has medical training, sort of quack doctor training. He is known to have instances of insanity, hatred of women, so the profile's not bad. You'll find you've got a Dr. Ostrog on there as well. That's a similar profile. But then getting beyond the list, the Norton memoranda, who else do we have at the time? Who's looking good for Jack the Ripper? Well, there is something in addition to the policing. It's called Special Branch. And if you see the Johnny Depp film, they talk of Special Branch in that, and I will paraphrase what they say. You don't mess around with Special Branch messes with you, because they kind of police the police. They are tasked with special duties. For example, in London there was terrorism in the 1880s from Irish Republican cause, for Irish Republican causes. They're putting bombs on bridges, Trafalgar Square, the House of Parliament, to varying degrees of success. The Tower of London has an explosion there. Special Branch deal with that. If there's any sort of intrigue, it needs a special unit. That's what the Special Branch was for. Who's in charge of Special Branch? Well, one of the senior men there is Inspector George Littlechild. Now, Littlechild, he was in post before the crimes of Jack the Ripper, during, and after. Now, that's rare. A lot of the other officers, they'd gone by the time of the end of the Ripper crimes, or they go shortly after. Littlechild's still in position. Now, to hold his position there, it's a tough job. It's a very responsible job. And so when there was a correspondence between Littlechild and George R. Sims, who was a very well-known and respected newspaper editor in Britain, a few years after the end of the crimes, Littlechild was asked, do you have any suspects for Jack the Ripper? And in this letter to Sims, he says, well, there's a very likely suspect, and it's Dr. T. And that Dr. T he's a quack doctor. He's never a truly qualified medical doctor, but he carried out abortions. He was a quack he created a pimple banisher that made his fortune, and his name was Francis Tumblety. And he, a most interesting character.
Wow. Now, I've heard rumors through the years it could have been one of the police officers, the investigators that was doing it. Now, has that been all ruled out?
Well, the thing is, because we are now working at a distance of over 125 years, it would be nigh on impossible to convict somebody of being Jack the Ripper. And so it